Hi, everybody, and welcome to a very unusual class. The internet is down here at ESU, reminding us of how dependent on it we have become. We have 3 folks in class, which means I assume that many other folks were planning on connecting via Zoom, but Zoom is down along with the rest of ESU's internet, and not only that, but even if we had Zoom, the computer's not actually connecting. So the Ethernet cable connections aren't working either. So we're making this recording to be posted on the class Canvas site later. The 4 of us, plus anybody else who may straggle in a few minutes late, will have a conversation about John Locke's view of property. It will be our last class on John Locke, and then we will move on into Jean-Jacques Rousseau later in the week. It's actually kind of funny that we're starting Rousseau this week, because one of Rousseau's points was how dangerous it is to become over-dependent on modern day, and this would be in his day, the 1700s, modern day technology. So here we're about to start reading an author that warned us that too much technology makes us too dependent on it, and what happens? Right, we lose the internet. So it's kind of perfect in a way. And so maybe we can tie in the events of today with our discussion of Rousseau when we get to Rousseau on Wednesday. But that's Wednesday. Today we're going to finish up Locke. So, and of course, it won't be interactive for the virtual folks, but for the 3 folks here, let me ask you, did everything go smoothly with getting the exam uploaded? So the internet was working when you uploaded your exams, yes? Okay. So it was working as recently as last night. Okay, that's good news. That's good. So no problems. That's great. Okay, so if you need to upload your exams still, probably won't start grading them for another day or 2. And so wait until the internet's back up, and then maybe later today or tomorrow, go ahead and upload that, and I won't count it as late if it's up before I start grading them. I am going to ask for a reaction note this week. This will be your chance to weigh in on Locke and Hume with a reaction note. So we'll go ahead and do that. That was also the exam, but this is a chance to maybe be a little briefer and kind of have some fun with it. So there will be a reaction note this week, again, assuming all the technology comes back up and is working the way it should. And then we'll take a little break from that, and then we'll have another exam late in the month going into April. And other than that, we'll just keep reading and having class discussions. You 3, any questions or comments for me?
Can we use the same prompt on the exam as we will on the reaction note? Or do you kind of advise against that?
Oh, that's a good question. So the question was, can you use the same prompt on the reaction note on Locke and Hume that you did on the exam? I think that would be fine. Maybe, rather than repeating something, maybe you could say something like, as I was writing the exam, there was something I wanted to write about, but I didn't have time, or I didn't have space. So there's this sort of extra thought, just like, sometimes academics use footnotes. It's like, this is like a really long footnote. I wanted to get more into that, but I needed to stay on topic, so I stuck with that. But I want to circle back around to this point I wanted to make. Something like that. So not so much a repetition of what's in your exam or a summary of it, but just, there's a point I didn't get around to in the exam, I'm going to make it now. And that would be fine. That would be fine. And you can even discuss the exam. You could discuss the exam prompt in your answer if you wanted to do that. Totally fine. That'd actually be kind of a fun way to do it. Yeah, 2-page long footnote. And, yeah, good question. What else? Okay, I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to dive in. So we need to, in my opinion anyway, go into a little bit more depth about John Locke and property, because property is so central to his theories. And there are a few different quotes from a few different parts of the text, including the part that I assigned to read for today, that make things a little bit complicated. But it's well worth talking about. Obviously, I'm not going to put anything up on a screen, but I can point to the paragraph numbers in the reading. And by the way, I got everything moved over to the current copy of the book, so the page numbers will all be from the current edition, which looks like this. All right, so first one is earlier on in the reading. It's actually in a chapter called Of Property, so it's pretty clear where he's going with that. And I thought we would take a look at paragraph 31. And also, I believe I mentioned this, when I showed that PowerPoint, but I'll just repeat it briefly. Most of us Americans are familiar with the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that's in the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson drafted that. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was actually riffing off of something that Locke wrote. Locke wrote that, using the gendered language of his day, that every man is entitled to life, liberty, and property. And property became pursuit of happiness with Thomas Jefferson. That's not to say that Thomas Jefferson didn't think that property rights were a big deal. He absolutely did. But in drafting the Declaration, he elected to go with pursuit of happiness. But that actually comes from Locke, life, liberty, and property. Property was massively important in Locke's theory, and I think that's still relevant today. So let's take a look at, paragraph 31 in this second edition of the book right here. It's on page 294 in the second column. 294, second column, and that's in chapter 5, which looks like it's the Roman numeral, it looks like the letter V, and it's called Of Property, and it's paragraph 31, and he wrote this. It will perhaps be objected to this, that if gathering the acorns or other fruits of the earth and sea is an archaic way of saying etc., other fruits of the earth, etc., makes a right to them, then anyone may engross as much as he will. To which I answer, not so. The same law of nature that does by this means give us property does also bound that property too. God has given us all things richly. He cites a Bible verse. Is the voice of reason confirmed by inspiration? But how far is it given to us? To enjoy as much as anyone can make use to any advantage of life before it spoils, so much he may by his labor fix a property in. Whatever is beyond this is more than his share and belongs to others. Nothing was made by God for man to spoil or destroy. Now what I want you to do is jump way ahead in the reading to a passage that kind of contradicts this. Let me make sure, is that the one I want to use? Yeah. Yes. Page 348, first column. Paragraph 228 in chapter 19, which is a Roman numeral, looks like XIX, of the dissolution of government. 348, first column, paragraph 228. And he wrote, but if they who say it lays a foundation for rebellion mean that it may occasion civil wars or intestine broils, to tell the people that they are absolved from obedience when illegal attempts are made upon their liberties or properties, and may oppose the unlawful violence of those who were their magistrates when they invade their properties contrary to the trust put in them, and that therefore this doctrine is not to be allowed, being so destructive of the peace of the world, they may as well say upon the same ground that honest men may not oppose robbers or pirates, because this may occasion disorder or bloodshed. So, first of all, he writes about illegal attempts being made upon liberties and properties. And then he continues to say we can oppose the unlawful violence of those who were their magistrates, which is to say government officials, when they invade their properties contrary to the trust put in them. So, there are two different things going on here. In the first quote I read, he argues, you have a right to property, including a right to turn perishable property, like, say, food, into something durable, money. In other words, you have a right to grow food, keep what you need, sell the rest, and keep the money, so long as you use this property. So long as you use this property for something productive. As long as you're engaged in using this property for something productive, it's yours. On the other hand, he says, if, and this is not a contradiction, it's just another part of the argument, that the people have a right to rebellion if government or should either, number one, fail to protect your property from robbers or pirates, or B, if government is the robber or the pirate and the government is trying to take your property. Now, I think it's safe to do this with only 3 people here, 4 counting me. Think about the debates, if they can be called debates, fights, even violence we're having today in our political culture. One side of that, which some extremists within that movement have resorted to violence within the last few months, argues government is trying to unjustly take our property and we will not have it. We have a right to rebellion. Government does not have the right to unjustly take our property, including through taxation. Money is our property. Government taxation is unjustly taking our property. But their opponents might be quick to point to that earlier passage that says you have a right to property insofar as you can enjoy it. And by the way, he doesn't mean enjoy just in the sense of have fun with it. He means do something useful with it. And so long as you can do something useful with it, you have a right to that property. There might be people on the political left that would argue there are some people that have amassed a great deal of property that is not doing anything productive, right? So we have people on the left saying some people who have tremendous amounts of property, the 1%, whatever you want to call them, they've amassed more property than they can enjoy. And the people on the other hand are saying taxation is unjust usurpation of property. We invoke our right to revolution. What do you think? Go ahead, Tommy.
So I was kind of on the same page as you. I was thinking, first thing that came out of my mind was taxes, obviously. I think I agree with you. There is an amassed amount of wealth within the top 1% and even within the top 1% of the top 1%. So like Bezos and whatnot. And my opinion on that is I believe that taxation is legitimate just because it has been a practice that's been done since antiquity because a government does need funds. A government cannot solicit funds from a society without taking it. But we do have a right to assign legislatures or assign people to make those laws. such as we give Congress the power to levy taxes within our Constitution because we, the people, have consented to that. That was part of the point of the entire point of the American Revolution was the taxation without representation.
Mm-hmm.
So, with that in mind, I think when people amass too much wealth, a concentrated amount of wealth that is utterly ridiculous, whilst people are starving, whilst people don't even have homes in a lot of places, we have a huge problem with our homeless rate. I think the government does have a right to impose a bit more taxes on them to redistribute funds to ensure that everyone can have property.
Okay, so Tommy said several things. One is that there's not only a 1%, but a 1% of 1%, a 1/10 of 1% with a very concentrated wealth that may exceed how much property they can use and enjoy. But he also brought up the idea of taxation without representation, which is a very Lockean idea. It's also what it says on Washington, D.C.'s license plates, if you've ever seen those, because they don't have statehood. But that's the idea that if you don't have a right to vote for the legislature that levies these taxes, then those taxes are illegitimate. You know, you don't get to choose them, but yet they get to tax you. I think those are really good points. Now, it seems like what we're dealing with now is that what happens when you have a right to vote, you vote for the legislature and other offices, like President of the United States and so forth, and your side loses. You had a right to vote, but you lost. And it may be that the side that won is going to levy a tax on you. Now what?
I think you just have to accept the fact that you did lose by some kind of majority. Because at least in a fair and free election, you do have the potential to vote them out of office next time.
And Tommy argued you have to accept that because you have the right to vote them out of office next time. Doesn't mean they'll be in office forever. You're right. You're right, and that's a good point. As long as you can count on the electoral system being such that you have the right to vote again next time, then you accept that, all right, for now I'll pay this tax. All right, good. Now we're going to call on Viri.
And then there's also nothing against just talking to representatives, so you can always like send an email, call them. So there's nothing saying that you can't do anything about it now. Like tell them, hey, these are my issues. Like I know that maybe you're against them, but can we reason it or can you do that at night? You know, there's nothing saying like I have to wait like 4 or 2 more years until I can say anything. You can always speak out, and maybe they might be influenced, and maybe they're willing to negotiate.
And Viri is pointing out you also have the right to speak out, to negotiate. It's not only a matter of winning the next election, but being part of the process. Maybe one side wants higher taxes and more government services, one side wants lower taxes and fewer government services. Well, we might have to compromise, God forbid, right, in today's political climate. But that might be, have to use that voice to negotiate, like you were saying. Great start. Now let me push this a little. Now this idea is a little bit archaic, but it's still out there. And I think it's a significant influence on some groups on the political right in our country today, such as the Tea Party, which is that a pretty close reading of Locke would seem to suggest that if you don't own property, you don't have the right to vote. If the purpose of government is to protect property, then there's an argument. I don't believe this myself, but there's a reading of Locke that would say, well, okay, then if you don't have property, you don't have the right to vote. A practical example of where this comes up is with property tax votes in local communities. So you get a community, say Emporia, Kansas, and we're going to vote, should we have a property tax levy for the public schools? And periodically, not necessarily in Emporia, but just in different places around, people will make the argument, if you live here and are registered to vote, but if you rent, you should not vote in that election. Only property owners should vote. Now, the pushback on that argument is that anytime there's a tax, it has an indirect cost. So, for example, if you live in an apartment in the Emporia School District, your landlord has to clear all expenses and then make a profit, or the landlord will go out of business and shut the place down or sell it. So your property taxed indirectly through the landlord. In other words, if they raise property taxes, the landlord may have to raise your rent or go out of business. Right? So you do pay taxes indirectly. And we could go on and on about indirect taxation, but the point is, technically, property taxes affect renters too. Okay, one way or the other, somebody's got to pay that money. As landlords aren't doing this for charity. This is a business, and they have to clear their expenses and still make a profit. Nevertheless, do renters really know that or think about that? Or are they just thinking, hey, let's raise the taxes on the homeowners and the money will go to us? You know, to schools we can put our kids in. I don't know. It's complicated, but I'm just giving you a real world example of where sometimes people today will make the argument, if you don't own property, you shouldn't vote. So, and I'm not endorsing that argument, I'm putting that out there for the discussion. It's a rather archaic argument, but it is pretty close to what Locke was writing. Okay? So what do you think of that argument?
I think that's stupid.
I think that's stupid. Go ahead.
It discriminates against the poor.
And it discriminates against the poor. Clearly,
A lot of people, like, it.
yeah. Right on. Right on. Stupid and discriminates against the poor. Tell me your name.
Angela.
Angela says it's stupid and it discriminates against the poor. Clearly, lower income people are more likely to rent their homes. There's no question about that. Not always, but often. So it is going to skew things toward the middle and upper class if you do that. No doubt about it. Go ahead.
I agree with Angela. In terms of voting in general, in like general elections, I don't think having property should matter because people in some form are going to be paying some kind of taxes and levies. It's renters who might not be paying property taxes per se, but they're still paying income taxes, they're paying other kinds of sales taxes that help fund the government. So as long as you're helping to fund society as a whole, you should have a say in pretty much all matters of all facets of society.
Okay, so Tommy made the point that we all pay taxes in some form. It could be indirect, like what I was saying in my example, or it could be taxes, it could be the sales tax, it could be income tax, withholding taxes. Everybody, including lower income people, pays some form of taxation. So again, not buying the argument that non-property owners should not have the right to vote. Let me push it a little bit here. I think the argument is, maybe I shouldn't call it an argument though, the fear, how about that? The fear is that if there aren't some checks, non-property owners can just use their votes to expropriate the property of the property owners and give it to themselves. And that will undermine our property-based system of trade. I have, you don't, why shouldn't you vote for somebody that will tax away what I have and then you can have it? And the fear is we have to put some kind of checks on this before this gets out of hand. And so you'll hear arguments, for example, it's come up in the Kansas legislature. Tax increases should not pass by a simple majority vote. It should take a supermajority, which would make it next to impossible to ever pass any tax increases. And that argument is not applied to tax cuts, by the way, only tax increases. My home state of Missouri has what's called the Hancock lid on taxes, named after a politician from the 70s and 80s who got this ballot initiative passed that controls taxes at the rate of economic growth in the state, and things like that. And the basic argument here is we can't just say, let's elect a legislature and then leave it to a simple majority what they want the tax rate to be. No, 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 no. Because it's awful tempting for those non-property owners to try to get a piece by voting for people that will tax the property owners. You know, the Tea Party movement is obviously, it's a reference to the Boston Tea Party, but it's also an acronym for taxed enough already. So what do you all make of that? Go ahead, Tommy.
Barring the fact that I think funding schools through property taxes is kind of a bad idea.
Uh-huh.
Because it's a system we have, I think because even lower income people still have to send their children to school, they want the best for their children. So because children don't have the right to vote like we do and they have more limited rights, I think in that kind of circumstance, they do kind of have to have a say even though they're not paying property taxes per se. They have to step up and say, we need to do this for our children because they need to be educated, they need to know more about how society functions. But I kind of do somewhat agree with that argument you were saying, because I've heard that side from my dad. Because my dad grew up in communist Vietnam, and my family were farmers. We grew enough food to feed ourselves. But during those times between 75 and about 92, the government would impose harsh levies and taxes on people's food. So my family, for instance, would go several kilos and the government will take some of them.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately enough for my family, we did manage to survive with that one. However, other people were not as fortunate as my family, and it led to famines in between those times. And it wasn't just one, it was several. And they resulted in hundreds of thousands, if not possibly millions of deaths. So I can't understand that argument and where they're coming from.
So Tommy said a lot. I'm kind of going backwards through what you said, that your family, or your father specifically, actually experienced this living in communist Vietnam. They were farmers, they grew food, they kept some of it, but it was taxed, and the tax reached the level that it actually caused famine. And of course, obviously, your family emigrated to the United States, and here you are, right? But he also pointed out that maybe property taxes aren't the best way to fund schools, which is another interesting argument. They just rethink the whole thing, which they have done in some states. In Michigan back in the 90s. They radically redid how they funded schools, and it's now mostly sales taxes. Those have problems too. And then the final point was that even people that own property have a vested interest in the education of their children. And so there's a right to vote there. So you can kind of see it from both sides, really, is what you're saying, that having actually had family that experienced excessive taxation on their crops, but also a family with kids in public schools, even if they don't own property, they have an interest. That was really good. All right, so what do the rest of y'all think?
I feel like they're trying really hard to limit the voices of others. Because, I don't know if this is the correct analogy, but when Black Southerners were trying to vote, you know, you have that impossible test that you have to pass in order.
Yeah, the literacy test.
Yeah, and it feels like, oh, you don't own property, you don't get the right to vote. It's another kind of very, I don't know, biased against the poor to do this, you feel?
So Angela brought up the literacy tests from the Jim Crow South, and the idea of just these arbitrary barriers. In that case, of course, they were targeting African Americans, some of whom did own property, but many didn't. And then you would have something like the poll tax, which was directly economic, so that it was just a question of if you could afford the poll tax. And if you couldn't vote. And that this kind of reasoning, that why are we letting non-property owners vote, can lead to stuff like that, which it absolutely can. I mean, this kind of logic was used to justify some of those laws. I've read it, I've taught it. I know you're right. So this is our chance to talk about it and see what we want to do with it. Okay? What do you think, Barry?
I think that's the other point, that a lot of these arguments are just another way to kind of exclude a really vast majority, a growing majority in the states right now, where you just see a lot of people losing their homes, losing the ability to maintain it. I know that, like, there was a big argument of whether they should even pay rent right now, because a lot of people can't right now.
Right, and there have been rent moratoria during COVID. It varies from locality to locality, yeah.
So it just feels like, okay, this is our one shot to finally, like, just get rid of all of them. And it's, honestly, with all the talks of, like, other voting suppression like this, it doesn't surprise me that talks like this are also coming into play, because, like, why not take advantage of the situation? So you can just take away, and, like, the fear of, well, would they gain power, and then they're just trying to take away what we have. Why would they do that? Because then they would put themselves in that position, and they could have somebody else. You know, it's a cycle, and there's no logical reason why somebody would do that if they knew that if I got into that position, I would suffer eventually too. It just doesn't make sense to me that a person would willingly make laws that would be against somebody who's wealthy, and then become wealthy themselves, only to have that turn against them. It's just a way for, I think, them to fearmonger even further.
Well, that's a good point. So Very pointed out that this logic could even extend to where a majority of people couldn't vote, depending on how many people own property. You're right. You're right. And like, what's the threshold? I mean, all of us own some kind of property. You know, it might be something that's worth $10, but it might not be a piece of land, but property isn't just land. But obviously, we're talking about some type of threshold. Right? We talk about personal property. The stuff in your pockets is personal property. But presumably, if you're making a property qualification argument, you don't mean that. You mean some land or a certain amount of wealth or what have you. And you could take that to where absolutely most people in a society couldn't vote, only a minority. In fact, I mean, Lockean logic, right? In the early United States, it was property owning white males. Then we dropped the property. Then later we dropped the white, at least as far as freed slaves and their descendants. Still wasn't extended to Native Americans unless they paid taxes. And then women in 1920. And then you have the Jim Crow laws, where supposedly African Americans had the right to vote, but not really. And so absolutely it could cover a majority. In fact, clearly property owning white males makes for a pretty small minority. That's not anywhere close to a majority. And she made the point that if the dream of people that don't presently own much property is that one day they will, why would they want an excessive tax that they eventually will have to pay? Their self-interest is, well, of course we don't want unreasonable taxes. We hope to have enough property someday that we will have to pay that tax. And when we do, we want that to be reasonable. So it's in the self-interest of upwardly mobile people not to increase the tax too much that someday they're going to have to pay. Good discussion. So I haven't sold anybody here today on the idea that if you don't own property, you shouldn't vote. I don't believe that either. But then what would you take to be the argument on the other side that you do have a right to vote, and you have a right to vote on things such as taxation, even if you personally are not in a position where you're paying very much in taxes right now? Remember, this is a political philosophy class, so what we don't have to get into the practicalities of it. We can do that in other classes. But what theory justifies that? What gives you that right to vote? Go ahead, Tommy.
I think that goes back to the fact that I pay taxes. So long as I pay any of those, if not everything that the United States ever does.
Okay, so if you pay any taxes at all, which really we all do, you know, you buy something, you pay sales taxes. You could be as poor as a church mouse, but if you buy something subject to sales taxes, you're gonna pay sales taxes. That's it. You have a right to vote. Of course, we don't all pay the same amount in taxes. We don't all have the same amount of income, but we all pay something. Makes sense. Makes sense. What do you think, Barry?
Well, the argument against that, which I don't like, but the argument against that is, well, some people just don't have the right to vote, because I know a lot of felons don't have the right to vote, even if they weren't innocently charged. Immigrants obviously don't have the right to vote because they're not citizens. So, well, I would like to say, yeah, we pay taxes, we don't have, even if we're here illegally, we're doing our jobs and everything. But that's just not the case, and that's not the reality. The reality is, there's a lot of, you have to be a citizen, you can't have a felony, and there's a bunch of other things that we've made to just limit it. And unfortunately, we can't just be like, yeah, I pay taxes at work, I have a right to vote, because that's not true anymore, forever.
And Very pointed out, there are actually a lot of people that do pay taxes that don't have the right to vote. I actually study this area, which is one of the reasons I brought it up, right? The right to vote for people that have been convicted of felonies varies tremendously. So in Maine and Vermont, they set up absentee polling stations inside prisons. And the inmates vote from their last home address prior to being incarcerated, or the one they're using, which is usually a family member. That's where they're considered to be living for the purpose of figuring out what districts they live in and so forth. And they vote absentee. And then at the other extreme, in Georgia, which has been really in the news right now because of a politically changing state. Florida prior to 2018, Virginia, although that's changing, and now Iowa, which didn't used to be that restrictive. They just changed recently. It is extraordinarily difficult to ever vote again if you have been convicted of a felony. Technically, you can petition the governor. However, you only get, I believe in Georgia, you can only do it once. And that's a pretty high bar. Now in Virginia, when Terry McAuliffe was governor, he granted a mass granting of those petitions to tens of thousands of voters. In Florida, that state repealed felony disenfranchisement by ballot initiative in 2018. So things are happening. But the other issue is that a lot of people that have been convicted of felonies in states that are in the middle, like Kansas, don't actually know what their rights are. So they may think they've lost the right to vote for life, even though they haven't. In Kansas, you haven't. The Topeka League of Women Voters mails out registration cards to people that have completed their probation and parole. But do people know that? That's another issue. But anyway, if we're going to be all Lockean about this, I think Viri's right. Doesn't matter if you've been convicted of a felony or not. If you own property, hey, you have the right to vote. I don't care if you've been, that doesn't have anything to do with it. You own property, right? Well, yeah. I mean, he might make an exception on if you have been convicted of a felony related to trying to take someone else's property. Because since he's all about property, he might make that argument. But what if you've been convicted of a felony that has nothing to do with trying to take someone else's property? If it's based on property rights, then that shouldn't have anything to do with it. So you see some of the interesting places you can take this logic, right? Go ahead, Tommy.
I was just going to say, I agree with Theory. Felony disenfranchisement is the most awful practice we have, one of the most awful practices we have in modern day United States, just because people don't give people with felonies a second chance to reform themselves.
Yeah.
Our prison system does not believe in reformation at all, so it makes it much harder for them to re-enter society. But I think they should be given the opportunity to vote again, because let's take since you brought up what if people don't steal like burglary or whatever, let's take people who have marijuana charges. A lot of states are now legalizing marijuana. People still have those on their records, and I think they should have the right to vote restored in states where they've lost the right to vote.
Yeah, being convicted of an offense related to marijuana has nothing to do with threatening someone else's property. I mean, if you wanted to, and that's, see, this, we're starting to get into where political theory gets really fun. And I also want to point out, for folks that didn't hear Tommy, at his point, he's very opposed to felony disenfranchisement because it prevents people from having a second chance and getting back into society. And that's a good point. Now, backing up to the political philosophy piece of this, if you, another group that really likes Locke is libertarians, right? And so you could go all libertarian and say, hey, see this piece of land right here? It's mine. If I want to grow marijuana on it, that's none of the government's business. What do you think about that argument? It's my property. I choose to grow marijuana on it. Go ahead, Diddy.
In Mexico, where my family's from, that's kind of how it is. Not necessarily marijuana, but
Right.
when you get away from the big cities, like Mexico City, Guadalajara, all that stuff, you get into the countryside where people will just build houses on any land there is, and nobody
Okay.
owns it, and so you suddenly just own it. And the government is so limited and ever changing that that's true of the people there, and they live pretty happily there, where they're just like, hey, I want to build a house here, go get townsfolk to help them, and that's their property.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously in other cases where it's more seedy, there's, like violence, or like, well, no, you can't build there because that's my property, and so you get into these parts where the government probably should step in, but they don't. And so it becomes like some places which are basically utopian and other places that are pretty dark.
Yeah.
So, the government should have some of a say, just because you get into those places where it gets to violence, just because nobody of higher power has anything to say against it. I'm going to forcefully take your property because nobody's saying anything else.
Sure. It technically was never yours in the first place. Gary's talking about rural Mexico, where their property rights are not strictly enforced, and sometimes a whole village will come together and help someone build a house on a piece of land that's just there. But other times there will be conflicts and even violence over claiming a property, and of course there's no title or deed or tax record or anything to resort to. It's just who claimed that property, so it could kind of cut both ways. There is a concept, and it's come up in the United States too, called squatters' rights, which is the issue of if there's unclaimed property and someone's living on it, and in particular, if they do improve it, if they pull a John Locke and they build a house, like your example, or maybe start farming it, or use it, to start a business or something like that, and that property was unclaimed, do you have some claim to it? You say, look, no one else was using it. I did something productive with it. Why shouldn't I have a right to that? But I imagine it also gets very contentious. In fact, I know it does. So, yeah, that's a great example, a real-world example. Yeah. Right on. So this is fun. So for the most part, I've been giving you a reactionary reading of Locke about all the, should only property owners vote. But there's also a radical reading of Locke. If you go back to that quote I read at the very beginning, the one about how one has a right to as much property as one can make use of. Okay? So somebody from the, a Bernie Sanders supporter or an AOC supporter might come in and say, well, you know what? If your net worth is over $1 billion, you probably have more property than you can make use of. Now, you could make a counter argument to that too. You could say, no, that's investment capital and that's being used to create jobs and so forth. But anyway, let's do a radical reading of Locke. All right, you have a right to property, and you have a right against unjust taxation. You have a right to what you can make just use of. But if your net worth is several $1 billion, do you have a right to all that? What if I were to come in here and say, you know what, I'm sorry, that's more property than you can make use of. You can pay a surtax. tax, 90% surtax, which that's what the marginal top tax rate was during the Eisenhower administration, by the way. It was 90% for the highest wealth category. Every additional dollar they made was taxed at a rate of about 90%. It was started being cut during the Kennedy administration, but why not? Isn't that more property than they can make use of? What do you think, Tommy?
I'm gonna say no, you don't have the right to that money. And I think I have several legitimate reasons why. One is because a lot of those companies don't pay taxes fairly. They often offshore that money into tax havens that are 0% tax rates that the United States cannot tap into. And they're making that money fairly illegitimately in comparison to the average person. And they're doing this while people are going hungry. They're doing this while people are homeless. They're doing this while people are getting evicted during this pandemic. And I think they should do a bit more to curb those types of behaviors and impose a bit higher taxes so that people do have enough to afford to live and feed themselves.
So Tommy's point was that for those that have enormously concentrated wealth, they also have means of not paying the existing taxes. Tax shelters, sending the income overseas, on and on and on and on and on. And so yes, it would be just to say, you've got more than you can make use of. And I don't know if that has a place in Locke, but as a practical matter, I see your point. Sure, I don't have any overseas tax shelters. Income has to be pretty high before that takes effect. Go ahead, Vinny.
I would agree, just because right now it kind of feels like it's a vacuum, where it's taking away from a lot of people, and there's these really wealthy people who are kind of just accumulating this and not using it. I know that, like, in this last stimulus check, Biden had said, like, oh, make sure you use it, don't just put it away, use it. And
Yeah, that's a big thing.
That they're not doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that some of them do, some really wealthy people do try to put it back to charities or whatever. But I do believe that there should be a cap on the amount of wealth, just because we've seen what that can do to different civilizations all the time when one person just becomes too wealthy and it kind of just crashes everything. So why not redistribute that wealth and keep the cycle going and everything healthy, instead of just like I said, right now it just feels like it's a vacuum where they're getting all this money and rarely any of it is being seen back right now.
Very good. So Verdi suggested that yes, there could be some type of cap that we could readjust it periodically, I'm sure, based on inflation and stuff. But her point was, yeah, there's some point at which, that's more wealth than you can make use of. Yeah, it sure is. And we just have to decide where to set that. It might be pretty high, but still, maybe there is some point. And you also brought a very contemporary example about the stimulus check, because that's a big thing with the stimulus payments going out. They're going out right now, actually, is that the hope is that people will do something with those. Because to stimulate the economy, it has to be used to purchase something or to do something. That's how the stimulus works. You go buy something, it creates jobs for the people that sell it and make it, and so on and so forth. And you're right, that's a big thing, that will people use their stimulus checks? In fact, there's another thing that relates to that, which is all the things we couldn't do during the pandemic. You couldn't travel much and go to concerts and go to restaurants and bars. And so consumers have not everybody lost their jobs. Now, some people did, and it's been really hard for them. The unemployment rate's pretty bad. But there are some people that didn't lose their jobs. And so another issue is, what are they going to do with that money? Is what they do with that money could determine the pattern of economic growth for the next few years. And it does. It's kind of a Lockean perspective, right? We've got stuff stored up in money. We didn't use it. Now what are we going to do with it? All right. And last call for today, I'm going to call on Angela.
No one needs that much money, especially when there are people in this world, even on this campus, who are homeless, who are deciding, do I eat tonight, or do I have my lights on? Do I have enough money to have some running water, some electricity? It's selfish, and it's morally
to Angela's argument, it's morally wrong to hoard money, especially large amounts of it, when there's poverty, which there certainly is. Okay, well, that's John Locke. This was a good discussion. I hope it's interesting to watch for folks that didn't get to participate. And I look forward to updates about the internet, but obviously I can't contact you over the internet with any updates. So we'll see. But in the meantime, I'll see everybody Wednesday.